When you're under pressure, you have a tendency to reach for stuff that really don't work. And God really can't get the glory out of your life until your expectations are removed from things that really don't work. Sometimes you have to pray through a process and a period to find the God of your darkest hour. This is not going to be a microwave breakthrough in your life. You have to go through a process in your life where you have made that level of contact. The Bible says that Paul did it too. 3 times he prayed, Father, take this thorn out of my flesh. Get this thing out of me. This thing is driving me crazy. 3 times the Apostle Paul had to pray about the same thing before he made contact with God. And God said, my grace is sufficient. I'm not going to move it. Your finances will not get better. That jacked up marriage will stay jacked up. Your children will continue to misbehave. But my grace is sufficient. You're never going to be appreciated. You're never going to be recognized. But you will learn my grace is sufficient. You don't need what you thought you need. You don't need who you thought you needed. All you need is me. My grace is sufficient. But Lord, I lost my job. My grace is sufficient. Lord, my house is in foreclosure. Where am I going to live? My grace is sufficient. Lord, I'm sick. I'm in a wheelchair. God is not going to heal every sick person. I know you don't want to hear that, but every sick person doesn't get healed. Every lame person doesn't start walking. But God's grace is sufficient. Sometimes a happy ending is not that everything works out the way you wanted it to. Sometimes when walking with God, you come to a realization where it just doesn't bother you anymore. And we've got to stop preaching this magic religion where everybody becomes a billionaire. Everybody's riding in a Rolls, and everybody's enjoying this wonderful, blissful marriage. The devil is a liar. Some of that stuff is not going to work out. But God said, my grace is sufficient. And I want to tell you this morning that there is a grace for every dark hour you find yourself in. There's a grace for every pressure you endure. There is a grace for every tragedy that presses down on your human soul. Sometimes you feel like your bridge is about to crack, but God said, my grace is sufficient. Sometimes you're saying to God, I'm like that silver bridge, Lord, and if one more car comes across this old bridge, I am going to crack. I just cannot deal with not one more thing. But God is saying, no man built you. I built you to my divine specification, and I took into consideration every single car that could come across your bridge, and I built you in such a way. You might not be pretty. You may be rusty. You may need a paint job. But I've got strength in you in places you haven't even seen yet. My grace is sufficient. Now what do we do in our darkest hour when all God says to us is my grace is sufficient? Single parents, some of you didn't think you could raise those children by yourself, but you did because God's grace is sufficient. God's grace is all you need. God's grace is all you need for whatever it is you face. So stop whining, stop complaining. Shut up. God's grace is sufficient.